Right, before I start, I'd like to thank Kate, Tom, and the rest of the team for organising the event and for inviting me to present at such an exciting space and at such a brilliant venue as well. I think this will be an amazing opportunity to discuss metamodernism and performance both here in Cardiff and of course internationally via the wonders of Zoom as well, so I'm really excited to see what the day brings. So my name's Dr. Tom Drayton. I'm a senior lecturer in acting, performance and directing at the University of East London. This keynote is in part a little introduction to how metamodernism, the analysis of which has largely been focused on other cultural studies, can also be seen within the field of performance, but also a little bit of just things that have been whirling around my head that I wanted to discuss today, and a little bit of reworked extracts from my upcoming book, which is going to be called Metamodernism in Contemporary British Theatre, A Politics of Hope/lessness, due to be published next year with Metamodern. And for the sake of my publisher, who is brilliantly accommodating in me trying out elements of this in today's keynote, those sections will be accompanied by a warning for clarity's sake. So a colleague of mine is retiring in a few days, and the other day, whilst waiting for one of those actually in-person together in a room, rare types of meetings to start, we got to talking about their time at the university, their teaching, their administration, and their research. And this then led to a conversation about my own research. Postmodern performance practice, isn't it? They asked. I usually stifle a gulp at this point in similar conversations. Despite this being the focus of my research for the last 7 years or so, I still can't quite seem to succinctly answer that I know what's coming next. Just what exactly do you mean by postmodern? Okay, so, and I fumble it, I go back too far and I start discussing how, as a culture, we came to understand modernity. I then instead come too far forward in time and realize I haven't addressed something else. I start again. Okay, so if at its basest level, postmodernity was detachment, irony, and depthlessness, there are works now that offer the opposite of that: engagement, sincerity, and depthiness, but at the same time still exhibit elements of detachment and irony. They're works that cannot escape elements of the postmodern, but also move beyond it, that swing, let's say, between sincerity and irony, that are ironist, to steal from Greg Dember, at both once ironic and honest, or swinging between the, oh, they say, like everything everywhere all at once. Could I have the next slide, please? They'd got it. For the first time, I realized I had an insanely popular Academy Award-winning example of exactly what I was talking about. A film that is probably the most accessibly mainstream example of the cultural sensibilities that have been labelled by better thinkers than me as part of a wider metamodern cultural shift, because they cannot comfortably fit within what we've come to term the postmodern. That being said, I know that not everyone has seen the absurd 2022 box office surprise from writer-directors Daniel Kwan and Daniel Scheinert that, and I'm quoting a description here from Denver again, brings together existential explorations of multiple reality theory and nihilism with martial arts action, comedy, and a touching story about an immigrant family going through multi-dimensional, non-linear reckonings in which their shaky bonds are reconsidered. So, I don't want to spoil the plot or assume that everyone knows what I'm talking about. That being said, the film is a clear example of the metamodern sensibility that even one half of the directors mentioned metamodernism in an interview about the film. Could I have the next slide, please? To be brief, the film centres around the conflict between different attitudes towards the meaning/lessness of existence when it becomes clear that you are one infinitesimally small part of an infinite multiverse of possibilities. When there is no point to anything, do we, to put it bluntly, find that depressing or exciting? Next slide. To quote Dember again, in other words, regardless of whether we awaken to such a scary consciousness in which nothing matters, or to a kind of warm and fuzzy one in which everything is connected, the point of the movie is to stare into the face of either of those overwhelming realizations and ask, where is the place for our sense of individual humanness? But the film does not simply wave around the flag of cosmic trip-out and stop there, as a postmodern narrative might. It also doesn't insist the viewer arrive at a unified, grand, modernist reconciliation or a save-the-world conclusion, end quote. Instead, it occupies a very similar state to our contemporary lived experience, oscillating somewhere between the two. It also, and here's the main point, embraces art critic Jerry Zoltz's observation of a new artistic attitude emerging around 2010 that proclaimed that, and I quote, "I know the art that I'm creating may seem silly, even stupid, or that it might have been done before, but that doesn't mean this isn't serious." Somehow, one of the most poignant moments of the film, and apologies for a slight spoiler here, is when two characters find themselves manifested as rocks in a desert. Next slide, please. The conversation that they have is subtitled. We only hear the wind of this barren land, and we only see, well, the two rocks. The existential, familial conversation here falls into talk about science. Every new discovery is just a reminder, says one of the characters to their relative, who is also a rock at this point. We are all small and stupid, finishes the second one. They are rocks, they are small, but they are family. And these emotions are big and human. So big and human, in fact, that in screen 3 of the Barbican Centre's cinema in London, holding my relatively newborn son at that stage to my chest, I have to admit that I broke down crying at rocks. In mentioning the film as an example of this postmodern feeling, my colleague had hit the nail on the head and reminded me of the mainstream applicability of the aesthetics that have come to be termed metamodern. Everything everywhere works and was incredibly successful across so many demographics because its narrative and aesthetic choices tap into what was an emerging, but is now quite a rhizomatic cultural structure of feeling that is metamodernism. It oscillates between the sincere and the ironic, the epic and the tiny, the connected and the detached, the silly and the serious. This oscillation between what can be described as modern and postmodern predilections is central to what has been labelled the metamodern sensibility, with the term characterised by the oscillation between a typically modern commitment and a markedly postmodern detachment. Or again, as Greg Dember describes, overall, metamodernism can be understood to revive the positivistic aspects of modernism whilst retaining postmodernism's awareness of context and irony via oscillation. Next slide, please.
Edited extract from upcoming book.
A few years ago, I was searching for a term that encapsulated similar shifts that I was seeing within theatre and live performance. There was something happening in the shows that I was seeing that didn't per se fit the previous categorization of postmodern performance practice. In The Death of Character, Eleanor Fuchs describes her own struggles with identifying just what was going on in her own experience as an audience member, critic, and theorist in New York City in the early 1990s. She mentions how seeing new work across the city and in turn writing reviews and about that work for weekly newspapers, teaching students and reading theory instigated and developed her thinking on theatre after modernism. She describes the driving force behind this, however, as embodied in herself and her own experience, relating her, I've got this quote on the next slide, search for a language in which to describe new forms that have appeared both in actual theatres and in the theatricalised surrounds of contemporary public life and discourse. The theatre she was experiencing at the time did not fit into what had been labelled modernist theatre or modernism more generally. However, even more known oppositions to modernist theatre practices, and I'm quoting Fuchs here, older categories of fantastic, theatricalist, and the absurd, whose effects realism underwrites through contrast, had little explanatory power either. Fuchs details how this vertiginous new perspective was at once artistic and broadly cultural, existing at once within the theatre and theatre practices, but also expressed in wider, more general cultural shifts outside of the theatrical bubble. But, she states, I lacked a name, much less an adequate vocabulary and grammar through which to discuss, explore, and explain this shift. Next slide, please. Thank you so much. I mentioned Fuchs here as a reflection across time and space of my own experience in searching for an adequate vocabulary and grammar to explore and explain the methodological and aesthetic shifts I've experienced across the theatrical landscape that, just as Fuchs experienced in regard to postmodernism in the 1990s, I also see as an interconnected part of an aesthetic shift across the wider and political landscape of the 2010s beyond postmodernity. In part, my research is an attempt to unravel particular strategic, methodological, and aesthetic shifts within the landscape of theatre and performance over roughly the past decade, in such a way as to make clearer how such shifts are connected to a structural shift beyond what can comfortably be labelled postmodernism. Next slide, please.
Edited extract from upcoming book.
I confess that I was hesitant to include the following anecdote here. But as the slide shows, this will also be used in the book that I'm currently working on, so I have to get over this hesitation at some point anyway. But I'm aware that in telling this anecdote, I might make myself quite unpopular in certain circles within theatre and performance studies. However, I feel that it's important to illustrate some of the catalysts behind my decade or so long preoccupation with this topic. So here it goes. I can't stand forced entertainment. That might not mean much to some of you at this conference specifically, but those embedded in theatre and performance scholarship and the teaching of this might have drawn a sharp intake of breath or a laugh. But I'm being unfair. It's not that I can't stand them. That's not true at all. Let's say I couldn't stand them. Or, okay, let me explain. Next slide, please. Cast your mind back to 2010. I was part of a coterie of bright-eyed drama undergraduates who had been taken on a trip to see Forced Entertainment's latest production as part of a module that focused on postmodernism and performance. While student engagement across the module itself had been largely positive, it became clear whilst watching this production that something about the company's application of postmodern tropes within performance practice just didn't work for us. By 2010, the thrill of it all, which is really hard to say quickly, was familiar Forced Entertainment territory. I'm quoting Roberts here. As with much of the work that has preceded it, notes Alexander Roberts in his review, the company creates a world that enjoys the beauty of failure and the accomplishments and creativity that come from that. The piece itself is built around the idea that the audience are invited to experience a good time, to be entertained. However, as Lynn Gardner's review of the piece explains, it soon becomes clear that everything is fake and rubbish. Even the dancing is crap. People bump into each other, scuffles and fights break out, the fixed smiles crack and turn venomous. The piece is exemplary of, according to Gritzner, the company's impulse towards self-reflexive emancipation from a dependence on conventional strategies of narration and reception, in their use of fragmented structures, a dissolution of narrative forms, in interest in performing a dissection of what performing is, and what of an expected relationship between performers and audience is over the performance of character, story, or, in some ways, entertainment. The show interrogates the idea that a theatre company has a responsibility to provide entertainment to an audience in such a way that diminishes the entertainment factor of the piece. Watching the piece back in 2010, it became clear one by one that my fellow students began to switch off. Some simply walked out during the performance, a protest hitherto unheard of in a cohort who had spent precious student loans funds on subsidised tickets. Our tutor did not appear happy with these deserters and explained to us in an exchange that I will never forget that if we didn't like the performance, then we didn't understand the performance. It was our fault if we didn't find it entertaining. Our inadequate comprehension of the piece made it inaccessible. We simply weren't clever enough to enjoy it. Researching the reception to the piece has revealed that we were not the only documented example of student groups walking out during those performances. Of course, as a reviewer of the show for online magazine A Younger Theatre pointed out, in previous decades, Forced Entertainment, the experimental theatre company of the 80s and 90s, revelled in their mid-show walkouts and their letters of complaint from outraged of Oxfordshire. The same reviewer, however, goes on to explain how for them, rather than outrage, the audience's dissatisfaction with this piece came from the fact that, quote, there was something desperately incomplete about the show. It felt thin and unoriginal. Perhaps, they go on to question, Forced Entertainment have lost their touch. Perhaps with so many new and exciting theatre companies on the scene nowadays, they've become outdated. Or perhaps, heaven forbid, I simply didn't get it. In returning to the memory of my own experience of the thrill of it all again and again, I'm sure that I've embellished, romanticised, and cleaned up certain elements in my remembering. As such, I cannot be certain that the following happened exactly as described, or even occurred during a different exchange entirely, perhaps in a follow-up seminar, or in all honesty is entirely fictitious. However, in my probably edited memory, what happened following this performance is this. A fellow student pipes up, possibly standing revolutionarily on a table, and exclaims, "It's not that we don't understand it. We get it. It's literally forced entertainment. It's not meant to be entertaining per se, and it's forced on us as an audience that maybe expected entertainment. Great concept, must have been groundbreaking at one point, surely. It disrupts the traditional theatrical expectations a typical audience will have. But why do we have to sit through it now? I have a slight suspicion that people are sitting there annoyed at the experience and pretending to each other and themselves that they're enjoying it, but they feel like they should enjoy it. Otherwise, they're just not cultured enough. Maybe that's the point. But I think that says more about the state of British theatre going public than of the company and their intentions. Anyway, and here the student, who has admittedly spoken quite fluently for someone making this up on the spot, waves their hand dismissively and stands a little taller. My point is that the forced entertainment point's already been made. Great job all, and now we can move on. Now we should move on. Now we want to move on. Now we want to be entertained. We want stories, we want connection, we want empathy. Yes, we want deconstruction and an end to the high art/low art dichotomy. But isn't this kind of thing just becoming high art? Interjects another student. I mean, just look at who the audience were. And we understand, the first student continues with an appreciative nod to the interjector, the application of Barthes and Baudrillard to the realm of performance in a post-televisual culture. But, and here's the thing, it's got to be worth our while, doesn't it? It's all well and good saying that this is postmodern performance, but who is it for? Who does it speak to? What, I dare say, is the point? In my mind's eye, this rallying cry, itself a vast oversimplification and misrepresentation of forced entertainment's methodological approach to performance, sends us, a legion of prospective performance makers in our own right, into battle, immediately charging into studios and developing postmodern performance as an antithesis to the work we supposedly weren't clever enough to enjoy. In reality, however, this speech was probably only a weakly proffered response during the coach ride home, and any effect upon me or my fellow students was largely brushed under the carpet when we went on to write the assigned critical essays in response to the piece. Despite my narrative embellishment, though, the point still stands. Whilst as undergraduates we were engaging with what was considered contemporary performance methodologies, companies and theories, largely coalescing around both the postmodern and or post-dramatic as per Lehman, the strategies of creation and reception that we were being taught appeared to make sense at a historical and theoretical level, but did not completely relate to our own then current lived experiences. Take, for instance, both performance theorists and certain companies' own focus on the complexities around the digitization of theatre at the turn of the 21st century, through methods of integration between online technologies and the stage that were labelled as emerging, but were quickly becoming outmoded. From the application of live streaming or interactive video projection on stage, to the use of social media and online gaming platforms as original sites for performance. By the peak of the 2000s, the off-stage lived experience of my peers and I already blurred those boundaries of the offline and the digital space. Our personal relationships being formed and developed as much or even more so online as they were IRL. Although as millennials we had not reached the current level of digital integration that subsequent generations have been born into, we were the first early life adopters of social medias in our teenage years, or even latter stages of childhood, the digital natives of the early 2000s. To spend the night sharing details of your personal life with strangers over Tumblr, whilst watching YouTube videos of intricately choreographed recreations of, next slide please, High School Musical dance sequences performed entirely by Sims, only to venture into a seminar the next day and be told that a performance in which avatars on M-Porg's Second Life clumsily and slowly recreate a scene from Hamlet, whilst audience members awkwardly comment via text box, is the height of cutting-edge performance technology and a revolutionary trajectory for contemporary theatre, seemed at best contradictory, if not completely outdated. Look, I am aware of my own oversimplification of the teaching of postmodern performance practice within this example, particularly within the previous focus on intermediality. As Nick Kay warns, any attempt at defining the characteristics of postmodern theatre must consider first all the difficulties that intrude upon any categorical definition of what the postmodern actually is. But out there, on what was still the fringes of performance work, something new was happening. Something that didn't completely remove itself from postmodern forms of pastiche, collage, detachment, and irony, but also imbued elements of sincerity, connection, empathy, narrative, God forbid, and hope. It was at the same time in 2010 that Saltz observed the silly but serious artistic attitude emerging, and Robin van den Akker and Timotheus Vermeulen's following seminal article, Notes on Metamodernism, posited that this emerging attitude was reflective of, quote, new generations of artists increasingly abandoning the aesthetic precepts of deconstruction, parataxis, and pastiche in favour of aesthetical notions of reconstruction, myth, and metaxis, while simultaneously remaining aware of the problematics and critiques of such. It is in this period that particular trends and tendencies within the contemporary artistic and cultural landscape emerged that could no longer be explained in terms of the postmodern, and hinted at new structures of thought evolving through and beyond their episteme. These feelings were, quote, characterized by an oscillating in-betweenness, or rather a dialectical movement that identifies with and negates, and hence overcomes and undermines conflicting positions, whilst never being congruent to those positions, in which a new focus on an often guarded hopefulness and an at times feigned sincerity comes to the fore. As Vermeulen expands, there is the sense now, or new slide please, that you say, I cannot... We don't need to watch that, we can later. There is a sense now that you say, I cannot just be cynical, I'm so tired of being ironic all the time, I want to be sincere. You're not, we are all from the start ironic, that's how we were raised within the postmodern paradigm, but we want to be sincere. Next slide please. This oscillation between postmodern and seemingly modern predilections has been, within wider cultural studies, labelled metamodern through and beyond Vermeulen and Van den Aker's application of the term, and is particularly observable in, for instance, the aesthetics of the quirky in cinema, think Wes Anderson, not the vapid AI generations, and new narrative trends within contemporary blockbusters, think The Last Jedi, Everything Everywhere All at Once, or Don't Look Up. Specific shifts in contemporary literature, including the emergence of the genres of misery lit and autofiction, the rise in empathetic and sincere modes of lyricism within certain genres of music, such as freak folk and rap. Think Sufjan Stevens, Whitmer Thomas, Childish Gambino, Kevin Abstract, Hobo Johnson. The new golden age of American sitcoms that are as cynical and harsh, but have a warmer, more humanist spirit than their pre-2000s counterparts. Think Ted Lasso or BoJack Horseman, or the American remake of The Office, even. Or the rise in multiverse-based narratives across popular media. Think everything to do with Marvel and DC at this moment, again, Everything Everywhere All at Once, or even the gritty reboot of Riverdale got all multiversal a few years ago. Next slide,
Edited extract from upcoming
To return
book.
to the theatre. In the incredibly strange June of 2020, I found myself sitting on the floor of my living room with my wife, staring up at a laptop screen, on which was a collection of other audience members in their own living rooms, bedrooms and kitchens, all facing each other in our little Zoom-based boxes. Joining us from separate spare bedrooms or home offices were two performers from Bristol-based company Uninvited Guests. The group has been performing their show Love Letters Straight From Your Heart to audiences around the country in an in-person capacity since 2007, and in the midst of the original 2020 lockdown, have repurposed the show towards a Zoom-based online format. Next slide, please. The piece is built around each audience member submitting an anonymous song dedication prior to the performance, with the two performers playing these songs and reading out the dedications of love in its many forms throughout the show. The experience for an audience here is built around the possibility of having your own choice of song played and dedication read, whilst also knowing that every anonymous submission, some of which are incredibly touching, funny, personal, or even heartbreaking, has been written and submitted by another audience member who is currently in the performance space with you. Every performance of the show is filled with different songs and dedications that are unique to that particular audience in that particular space and at that particular time. The company's transfer of this format to Zoom within the context of a nationwide lockdown, retitled Love Letters at Home, transposed the physical intimacy between the audience members to a virtual space. Despite the physical distance between us as an audience, whilst we watch each other react to the dedications or nod our heads to the music from across unknown distances, instead of across a long banquet table as per the original on-stage Love Letters, that perceived feeling of intimacy is still there. These are intimate moments of our real lives that we're sharing together. One member of a couple suddenly becomes embarrassed or giggles uncontrollably or begins to cry as it becomes clear that their counterpart has written a dedication to them. We then listen to a beautiful dedication to someone's late mum. We scour the faces of the audience members in their living rooms. We may never know who wrote it, who chose to share this grief with the company and, by extension, us. And yet, we've all listened intently to what those audience members wanted to say about the person or persons that they, in some way, love. We've shared that moment together of listening. Benjamin Broadrib labels this concurrent togetherness and separation imbued through such Zoom-based performances as together apartness. He suggests that the pandemic amplified and catalyzed this sensibility, which already defined the opening decades of the 21st century, and that perhaps the defining signifier of our together apart existence during the pandemic is the stratospheric rise of Zoom. According to Broadrib, Zoom simultaneously facilitates effective connection, heightened further by a wider historical and cultural moment, and reduces our friends, our families, ourselves into depthless, low-definition digital duplicates. Whilst creating a sense of togetherness for people worldwide, Zoom's now familiar gallery view interface also serves as a persistent reminder of our enforced physical distance through and beyond the pandemic. Meanwhile, Uninvited Guests show reaches a climax, and little by little the audience are asked to dance. We, whether easily or begrudgingly, for me I admit it is the latter, stand up and shuffle awkwardly in our own rooms. But slowly the performers and the music encourage us further. We have, after all, started to become comfortable in this virtual space built out of disparate and yet somehow connected living rooms. The screen soon becomes a blur of tiny dancing figures, a couple in a ballroom dance embrace, a family doing the twists, an older woman nodding her head on the sofa. We, in our own ways, dance along to a song at once both cringe-inducingly cliched and beautifully perfect for the moment. Joy Division's Love Will Tear Us Apart, or Madness Is It Must Be Love. I can't quite remember the song, just the feeling of broad ribs together apartness as we danced along in our own little Zoom boxes. Then suddenly, the space on screen is disrupted. The performers grab their laptops and remove them from their desks. Our views of them on Zoom dramatically shift as the stationary webcam angles that we had become accustomed to over the past hour change and become mobile. There's a sudden sense of freedom, the Zoom-based frames of their existence quite literally opening up. As they dance with their laptops around their rooms, they give us glimpses of their separate backstage spaces, cables, microphones, a cup of tea. They spin us around, their Zoom box a jumble of extended arms, a beaming smile and blurred spinning background. And then, with the love song still playing from their laptops and ours, they leave their rooms. But they take us with them. We are carried down flights of stairs, through living rooms, into kitchens. One performer's family is clearing up after dinner, and we join them in the kitchen, still dancing. The performer brings their child into an embrace, puts the laptop on the kitchen counter, and encourages their child to dance with them. They are sheepish, embarrassed even, but they do join in. We see the performer's fridge, the dishwasher halfway loaded, the child naturally slightly embarrassed by having to join in with their parents' work. Not only have Uninvited Guests facilitated a space in which we as an audience were able to share glimpses into our own lives outside of the theatrical event, but they now open up their own homes to us too, bringing themselves and their lives, not just their performance-focused personas, into the piece. As we see them embrace and dance with the people that they love, their lived reality, their authentic selves, their authentic lives, become a central part of the performance experience. Participating in love letters at home, we fluctuate by feeling disconnected from each other through the webcam-focused, boxed-off nature of our existence as an audience within this digital space, and feeling incredibly connected with each other through participating within the structure of the performance that Uninvited Guests provide. It is an oscillation between connection and disconnection, a feeling of being dis/connected that permeates our theatrical experience. Next slide, please. And the next one. 2 years later, when we can return to the theatres, Will Dickey's autobiographical solo show White Sun investigates the tensions of inheritance, privilege, and addiction through a part memoir-style monologue and part physical theatre that is deliberately difficult both to unpick and to watch. Dickey takes the audience through his life as a performer through a continual, inescapable threading with a relationship with his father, from his family's history of cotton manufacturing, to his father's paying for his private school education, to the disconnect between the two of them regarding his current work. What I don't want to admit, states Dickey in the show, is that my job will never earn as much as my dad's job, and my job is simply an expensive and elaborate ploy to justify my need for attention. To quote Barrow's review, Dickey spends an immense amount of time alienating us. His movements are chaotic and often appear to have nothing to do with what came before. As a critic, and I'm still quoting Barrow here, you begin to mentally write the review. Interesting but rambling, long periods with nonsensical movement. But then he turns to the audience and asks if your mind has wandered, if you're bored, if you're wondering what's going on. He smiles and he makes you laugh. The mood lifts, the play moves on, and the cycle starts again. Barrow goes as far as describing Dickey's show as an anti-theatrical event, but I don't quite agree with them here. Yes, Dickey makes use of many techniques that serve to disrupt the theatricality of the performance, layers of meta-theatre, distancing, irony, and pastiche, but as in Barrow's example above, they are also undercut by moments of connection, of genuine sincerity in his attempts to unpack and unravel his complicated familial issues as constituent parts of his performative persona. The cycle that Barrow refers to could also be seen as this oscillation between these polarities. And in this way, whilst Dickey trades in some of the markers of postmodern performance that in some ways connect White Sun to forced entertainment's postmodern practice, It is this genuine connection, genuine search for engagement, sincerity, hope, and in some ways, betterment, both in terms of the personal and the performative, that offers something else, something beyond the reach of the postmodern. Next slide, please. The same year, We Were Promised Honey sees the audience sat facing each other, waiting for the show to begin. From within them, a voice starts to tell the story of 29-year-old Richard Russell, an airport worker in Seattle who on the 10th of August 2018 stole a 76-seater commercial airliner and flew it over the skies of the city for over an hour. He was not a pilot. He performed barrel rolls and loop-the-loops that the CEO of the airline later described as awesome. He could control the plane because he had learnt it from video games. Air traffic control were scared. When they asked him if he knew how to land the plane safely, Russell replied that he hadn't thought that far ahead yet. Ward stops the story there, and he tells the audience that this is the prologue, and that the story that will occur this evening will not have a happy ending. Given that they now know that the story will not have a happy ending, they are given a choice as to whether to begin the show or not. We can sit in silence for the advertised running time, says Ward, or one audience member can say, I would like to begin. I would like to begin, says one audience member, even if they know the story will end badly. We Were Promised Honey's conceit is based around Ward telling stories of the audience's future following the show, 1 hour, 2 days, 100 years later, and beyond. And through this, he comfortably invites audience members into the space to help with these stories, inserting details of their lives into these imagined future narratives. As George Matthews' review of the piece describes, the potential of being chosen primes us all to think about what we would do on stage, and we all become characters as both ourselves and as fictional versions of ourselves. This interventionist approach to the storytelling process raises many questions about the future, the past, where stories begin and end, and where we should place ourselves in them, and how we can ultimately use them to wrest control to ourselves in an inherently chaotic and meaningless world, end quote. Both Ward's story and Ward's storytelling encompass different polarities of expression, whilst the incredibly well-written imagined futures pendulum swing between hope and hopelessness for our entire civilization. Ward's direction of the audience, as according to Karen Marcus's review, is so clear and direct that it inspires trust. There's no fear of humiliation or of getting it wrong, but there's a darkness there. He's like a charismatic Grim Reaper in casual clothing with a sparkling diamond-stud earring, leading us towards the end, reminding us that it won't be happy and we cannot turn back. Richard Russell's story, of course, the person who stole the airplane, ended in tragedy. He was living, really living for a moment, whilst ignoring the inevitable consequences of his actions. And on a grander scale, of course, Ward reminds us that this is us in the Anthropocene. We Were Promised Honey disrupts the traditional theatre model. It's inherently meta-theatrical and utilises a postmodernity in its aesthetics, all of which have been done before, yes, but it centres storytelling and the collective act of storytelling in a way that feels at complete odds to what we've come to see as traditional postmodern or post-dramatic theatre practice. As Matthews states, what Sam Ward has done here is break out of the expectations of a theatrical narrative, reassembling the possibility of the medium to include us, the audience. And Ward's regathering is focused on the collective act of telling stories. Finally, throughout the show, even highlighted in its marketing, and you can currently go and see this, it's on tour around the UK at the moment, it's just been in the US, so please do look it up, is an inherent oscillation between hopelessness and hope, one of the main aspects of the Metamodern art in my understanding of the term. It's clear from reviews of the piece in both the UK and the US that this feels like something new for contemporary audiences. Matthews states that he, quote, left feeling put back together in a new way, with a revitalized sense of control over my life, like this was something within my grasp. And perhaps Marcus describes this hopeless paradox best when she states that we're not watching this, we're in it, traveling to the last moment we will spend alive. And when that moment arrives, the show does something so moving with a song, it's as life-affirming as it is devastating. And now to finish up, turn my attention to here, the circus. I admit that I was slightly hesitant when I received the invitation to present as keynote at this conference. It is extremely exciting to be able to work through the interstices between metamodernism and performance practices with such an exciting range of artists, practitioners, and thinkers. But circus? I'm comfortable playwriting. I am comfortable in a contemporary performance space. I am comfortable in the black box theatre. I am not, I admit, completely au fait with the circus. However, whilst I'm here in Cardiff, my MA students in London are busy developing final project performances for a festival at Camden People's Theatre in July. And one student is currently working on a solo performance that uses clowning to unpack, platform, and perform an autoethnographic experience of their own neurodiversity. Through both layering and uncovering their own clowning persona, they swing between the personal and the performative, the real and the fake, the absurd and the authentic, the ironic and the sincere, and how they interweave, intersect, and overlap through the act of clowning. And I suddenly thought maybe it's that, the Metamodern Circus, this pendulum swing that is enabled and strengthened by the clowning aesthetic. And upon reflection, I began to see other connections in the work of previous students across the institutions I've had the pleasure to teach at. The student who, during lockdown, blended existentially depressing takes on Sartre with ukulele ditties in their bedroom. Or prior to that, the student performed a physically demanding stand-up routine based on a dialogue between themselves and a recorded version of themselves that devolved into an incredibly revealing and sincerely personal unpacking of their own experience with depression, whilst also remaining hilarious, ironic, and above all entertaining. When I think back to my issues of forced entertainment's The Thrill of It All 13 years ago now, it can be boiled down to the fact that it simply wasn't entertaining for me. And to be told that I didn't find it entertaining because I was too dumb to understand it was wrong. The point of it was not to be entertaining. Don't get me wrong, I'm not saying that postmodern work cannot be entertaining, but post-postmodernism's height, there is something to be said about the increasing development of work by professional companies, companies on the fringe, and importantly, students, that offers connection, affect, and hope through, within, and beyond, and between disconnection, disaffection, and hopelessness. To end, final slide please, I want to return to the title of this keynote. It's also pointless, but it's not though, is it? It's really real, and when you feel it, you can really feel it. These are lyrics from Yardak's 2022 song 100% Endurance. And if you haven't heard anything by Yardak, they're a little bit like if the music of Ian Dury and the music of The Streets had a baby. The song itself revolves around the discovery, quoting the lyrics here, that there were others just like us, other beings, other creatures, other planets with other species who had other gods that they believed in. And the quite mundane responses to this discovery, like the fact that they interviewed all of them and every one of them, not one, could give any hint of a clue what they were doing here either. Between these are interjected oscillations between sincere and profound statements on love, life, and death in an inherent, inescapable irony. Quoting the lyrics here, the key to peace lies within us, and we'd already have achieved it if everyone was as enlightened as me. It's hippie bullshit, but it's true. As the unnamed protagonist of a spoken word song reflects on life and love following the discovery of an alien species, Yardak's lyrics here on screen are reflective of a metamodern understanding of contemporary theatre and performance. Performance is never real. It is inauthentic in nature. And yet, as we know, it's really real. And when you feel it, you can really feel it. Thank you. I think we have some time for questions, if anybody's got any, and I'll endeavour to answer anything.
That was really interesting, first of all, thank you. And a very clear explanation of modernism, which is hard to do, I think, or as clear as it can be. I really resonated with what you were describing about being taught postmodern cultural theory and fascinated by it, but feeling a disconnect. And I'm interested if you ever think about, as you are teaching metamodernism to Gen Z, if you ever observe or get a sense for what reactions are fomenting the I hate Sam Ward in 10 years that we might encounter?
That's a really good question. So I haven't been able to teach as much about modernism as I'd like to students. It's been a sort of element in my contemporary performance-making classes. And usually it's kind of tacked on at the end in that it's not as much of the syllabus as I'd like it to be. I feel as though to sort of get people up to speed in sort of contemporary work, we're still focused a bit on postmodern stuff, but as we're kind of working through metamodernism as an idea, as a structure of feeling, that at the moment is a bit of a labeling exercise, I'll not shy away from that. What I'm more interested in is going, look at what's out here and what is exciting in terms of work, and I'll bring them work that I find exciting and they'll bring me work that is exciting as well. And we'll find those connections there, rather than sort of imposing. I mean, part of what I'm attempting to do at this point is go, look, in terms of theatre and performance, there are things happening that I would say reflect these other things that are happening in wider cultural studies, literature, film, music, that have been labelled as part of metamodernism, and it is actually sort of happening within theatre, but there is a minimal amount of people labelling it as such. So possibly we can label it here. So it's a bit more of a exchange between me and students in terms of, I think it's this, what do you think? But I expect, yeah, I mean, in terms of me, part of me putting that out there in terms of like, this is how I felt back in 2010, and obviously it's stung me and I've turned it into research, it is awareness of the fact that that will probably happen in 10 years for my students as well. And I hope it does, because I hope we sort of continue to keep debating these points as well, absolutely. But that's a really good question, thank you.
I've actually got a microphone here if anybody else wants to ask a question so that we can catch it. Okay.
Yeah, thanks for this amazing talk. I really enjoyed
Tom.
it. It was really rich with lots of examples that were really appealing, so thank you for that. And I noticed that you brought up a quote by Eleanor Fuchs, I think, who said something about the theatricalized surround of contemporary public life and discourse. So
yes,
I'm wondering what kind of metamodern theatricality you would find in like day-to-day engagement with people. Like I can imagine some forms of play or pretend with loved ones being more metamodern as opposed to postmodern. So I wonder if you have any thoughts on the
I do.
Theatrical.
I do, and I'm really worried about sort of slipping into really generalized statements here, or things that I have no sort of backing up, I suppose, but sort of thinkings. And this is why academically I tend to focus specifically on theatre and that very small slice of it. But I think there's, in terms of, I mean, Vermeulen and Van den Akker talk about this idea of the as-if, which of course like links to Kantian aesthetics and that kind of stuff, but the idea that we are believing in things that as if they are true, even though we know that they're not true. And so if we're looking at metamodernism more of outside of a sort of cultural structure of feeling, when we bleed into sort of the wider political and sociological culture of it, the idea of, Seth Abramson, the metamodern poet, and then took down Trump on Twitter, basically, was like, the best way of describing this kind of thing is that we know, like, we know that the system is messed up, right? The whole sort of neoliberal system, and yet we still get out of bed every day and make breakfast and go to work, right? We can completely take apart and not believe in the system, and yet we sort of go within it as though it's true. And so that, for me, and this is completely baseless and generalizing, but I often think about how it kind of bleeds into more sort of general life, is things like political ideologies as well. Like, as a self-confessed Corbynite, like, there was this kind of really amazing belief in this fact that we could have this sort of reshuffle of political sort of ideologies and this kind of, but in a way, I suppose in my heart, I always believed it would never happen, right? So that you could sort of work towards it as though it was going to happen, and that kind of belief, and then of course we're shattered, and that idea of oscillation between hope and hopelessness for the millennials in that case is huge. But, there's something interesting, and again, completely baseless, but there's something interesting in terms of, and I don't have the studies for this, but the idea of like, marriage in terms of like a financial commitment or that kind of stuff, literally just talking to people within my institution and the people in generations below who completely, in an almost kind of like stance, have rejected this idea of marriage, and then this idea of it becoming a little bit more popular. And I mean, like, this is from completely personal experience, this is why I was completely baseless, but like, I'm obviously like married for love, but I'm also married for the fact that it would just sort of keep us together financially and tax reasons, and it also meant that I could leave the country because my wife is German. But don't tell HMRC that. But but so it's kind of like this. Marriage it's lovely. I'm in love. We didn't have to get married, but we kind of like, in a way, ironically loved that kind of like idea and doing it as if it was this kind of like old-fashioned thing, but we're still incredibly critical of it. And so that's a really personal experience, and I've never really sort of brought that up in an academic space, but it's kind of that idea of, I find that really interesting, believing in things as if they were true, even though we know they're not true, which I think is that it almost returned to, for me that's metamodernism, in that like the idea of the postmodern era disrupted all of these beliefs, and we understand that they're not true, but then we can sort of, the way we live our lives is we sort of work through those in a way that, yeah, we know they're not true, but we can still continue to work through them. If that makes sense. Yeah, okay, good.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Tom.
No worries.
We've come to the end of your time.
Thank you.
You'll be around to answer other questions and
Yeah.
conversations through the day. Luke, if you would like to step up. People who are online, if you want to have a quick stretch, or people who are in your seat, a quick stretch.